you everyone for joining us here this evening for the first in a series of Fielding Graduate University DEI Critical Conversations. I know that tonight we have a number of individuals joining us here, including the current chair of our Board of Trustees, Karen Bogart, and many other of our trustees members. I am Allison Davis Whiteeyes, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and I will be your host this evening. We are especially pleased to share this time with you as we close out Black History Month with reflections from some of our amazing colleagues. Tonight, we'll begin with an individual performance by Dr. Lanil Henderson as Carter G. Woodson, the African-American scholar best known for raising the national consciousness of this country about Black history. This performance and review of the life of Carter G. Woodson, and by extension, the historical legacy leading through to contemporary times, allows us all to reflect on the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, "Where do we go from here?" Dr. Henderson's performance will be followed by a 30-minute panel discussion with some of our esteemed faculty. As we move through the program this evening, please make sure to post comments and questions in the chat. If time is permitting, we will allow questions to be answered. So thank you all again. And at this point in time, please allow me to introduce Dr. Lanil Henderson. Dr. Henderson is an internationally recognized urban scholar. He has lectured and consulted on housing issues, energy management, environmental policy, and public management for federal, state, and local governments, as well as corporate and nonprofit sectors for over more than 30 years. His work includes serving as Dean of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences and eminent scholar at Virginia State University in Petersburg, Virginia. He also serves as a mentoring faculty member of the Educational Leadership for Change doctoral program at Fielding Graduate University. Dr. Henderson has received many recognitions and awards, including recognition as the Distinguished Chair in Teaching by the University of Baltimore. We are especially honored to have our beloved colleague, Dr. Henderson, perform one of his many one-man plays about the lives of Black intellectuals in American history. Tonight, we will begin with Carter G. Woodson. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lanil Henderson as Carter G. Woodson.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davis Whiteeyes. Thank you so much. And friends, I welcome you from my home at 1538 9th Street in Washington, D.C. And if you're not familiar with this neighborhood in Washington, D.C., friends, I want you to know that it has always been in the center of Negro history for as long as Washington, D.C. has existed. Just one block away from my home is the Phyllis Wheatley branch of the YWCA. Around the corner from my home, one block away, is the headquarters of the National Association or National Alliance of Postal and Federal Employees, one of the first Black organized unions in the history of the United States, representing Black postal railway workers. About 5 blocks from my home is the campus of Howard University, established in the 1867 and named after one of the 5 generals who presided over districts in the South to make sure that they complied with the terms and conditions of the end of the war and Reconstruction. Down the street from my home, about 7 or 8 blocks, is the National Archives, which did everything they possibly could to avoid keeping extensive records on the history and contributions and cultures of Negroes. But thank goodness we had institutions like Howard, we had our Negro churches and fraternal organizations that kept records and archives that were used by me and others interested in promoting the study of Negro life and culture. Now, I was actually born not in Washington, D.C., but in New Canton, Virginia. Now, New Canton, Virginia is in Buckingham County, Virginia, about 40 miles or so northwest of the city of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy. And I was born to two parents who were teachers and educators, but also had to work and scrap part-time to raise the three of us siblings under their roof. I was always interested in reading, thanks to my father and mother. And even when I wasn't in school, I was constantly reading whatever books I could get my hands on. And being born in 1875, I was born just a few years after the birth of the great Negro scholar who I admired and worked with, W.E.B. Du Bois. He was born in 1868. My parents were slaves, and they went through the emancipation as slaves. And it really wasn't an emancipation. It was simply a change in status because in the South in particular, the leaders of state government, especially the white leaders and those of the Democratic Party, tried to replace the old slave codes with something called the Black Codes, which did everything except re-enslave us, making it necessary for President Lincoln and the radical Republicans in the Congress to take measures to protect our rights as Negro people. And they weren't just protecting our rights, they were also protecting their political position, because when they came into the South to register voters, especially Negro voters, they would always register them as Republicans. And it bifurcated not only the racial situation in the South, since most whites who were former members of the Confederacy were Democrats, but it also bifurcated the political situation. For a period of time, I actually worked in West Virginia in the coal mines to try to establish enough funding for myself to go to college. And I eventually was admitted to a college in Kentucky, a very unusual college called Berea in Kentucky. And this college was unusual because it actually admitted colored people when most of the colleges were strictly segregated. And that would last only up to the end of the period of Reconstruction, so that by 1896, they too had become segregated. But I was able to go to school there. And while I was in school, I took a number of competency tests in not only history, but also in Latin and in mathematics and algebra, and excelled in all of these subjects to such an extent that I was later asked to be the principal of the high school, Frederick Douglass High School in West Virginia, that I had graduated from. So while serving as principal, I was still completing my requirements for the degree at Berea College, and would actually finish those requirements at the University of Chicago. So it ended up that I had a degree from Berea in literature, and I had a degree, bachelor's degree in history and literature from the University of Chicago. I went into the master's program at the University of Chicago, and there met a number of very progressive white faculty and staff who were trying to bring about integration and racial reform in the big city of Chicago and the adjacent areas. And I, as a result of a special scholarship, was able to attend Harvard University, becoming eventually the second Black person to receive a degree, PhD degree in history from Harvard University, the first being W.E.B. Du Bois. And the same dissertation committee that supervised Du Bois's excellent dissertation, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade, would also supervise my dissertation. However, my dissertation focused on European history. and I became quite expert in European history. I was actually discouraged from going into African history and Negro history by some of the members of the Harvard faculty, and felt that my doctoral career was in danger. So I switched to European history and actually went to France and spent some time at the Sorbonne in Paris studying, as well as the University of Berlin, where Du Bois had studied for 2 years. This actually served me very well in my interest in Negro history and culture, because one who was interested in this dimension of history inevitably had to study also the history of Africa and the history of Black people who were in the Caribbean, the history of Black people who were in Europe. And there were a substantial and significant number of Negro people in Europe, all over Europe, from London to Paris to Berlin to Amsterdam. And in fact, as early as 1914, the former mayor of Dakar, Senegal, a man by the name of Blaise Diagne, would be elected in 1914 to the French Chamber of Deputies, representing 5 communes that included parts of the French Union, like Senegal. So this was happening in the teens. So you're asking the right question. After I got my PhD from Harvard, very much like Du Bois, I was never invited to teach at a major white university, or any white university for that matter. And my first job was as a faculty member and later principal of a high school, 2 high schools in Washington, D.C. that were focused on the Negro population. One was Armstrong, and the other was Paul Laurence Dunbar High School. Those were my first 2 jobs, and I taught history there. I taught Latin, and I also taught Greek, very much like my colleague Du Bois, who in his first job at Wilberforce was not allowed to teach sociology because such a thing really didn't exist in these colleges, was not allowed to teach history, so he ended up teaching Latin and Greek. Eventually, we began to see that there was a great interest in the Negro, not so much by our detractors and our enemies, but also by many of our friends, Quakers around the world, as well as in the United States. And as early as 1900, Du Bois actually won an award for his exposition on the Negro at the exposition in France. So there was an interest there, and he had been part of the founding of the Niagara Movement, the first Pan-African Congress. So there was a great deal of interest there. There was also a great deal of interest on the part of Europeans in the Negro as a result of World War I, since many of them served in the war and came back and ingloriously experienced even more virulent and violent opposition to their quest for freedom when they returned from the war than when they left. I mean, there had already been major and bloody riots in Atlanta in 1906, the famous riot in Chicago of 1919, even stimulated the formation of a commission to look into the causes and preventions of that riot. And then the horrific destruction of the Greenwood section of Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, followed by the attack on smaller Black towns, some of which had been founded by former slaves, such as Rosewood in Florida, Mound Bayou in Mississippi. All of these things converged in my mind in importance, and I looked upon the understanding of Negro achievements and accomplishments all the way back to Africa as a way of uplifting the race on the one hand, and reminding the white race on the other that many of the contributions that they claimed were uniquely theirs were actually seminally developed by Africans, developed by Moors, developed by not Europeans, but people in their background that they now dismissed. It is also important to point out that as we were thinking about a way to memorialize, a way to establish on a regular basis something called Black History Week, we were inspired by several institutions in the Negro community. One was the church. And for all of the criticism that has been launched on the church, including the Negro church, I have to also point out that they were for many years the keeper of artifacts and archives on the part of Black families who were members of that church who did not and would not entrust their keepsakes to a white institution because they'd never see them again, especially if they had any value. So many of them actually kept their records and kept a number of their valuable artifacts, not in banks, not in the white community, historical societies or archives, but in the church. The other great contributor to the understanding and for the need for Negro history would be the world of the fraternities and sororities. And I want to point out emphatically that the first idea for a Negro History Week came from my fraternity, the Omega Psi Phi fraternity, and they created something in 1924 called Negro History and Literature Week. And that was in 1924, 2 years before I helped to establish the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. That was 1926. The other impactful set of events on the formation of Black History Week was the flourishing of the Harlem or Negro Renaissance in the United States in the 1920s. This wonderful conversion of music and art, poetry and literature, plays, sculpture, paintings that came from almost every quarter of the Negro community. And it was a very, very diasporic movement because they would use themes in the poetry and in the music that also came from the Caribbean, also came from Africa. So this was a major emphasis and a major contributor to our feeling that we should recognize on a regular basis something called Negro history and culture. So it wasn't just history, it was also culture. I should point out that as we were establishing the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, we were amazed at the number of people inside the Negro community and outside the Negro community who wanted to be a part of this institution. And so it still exists today and has become a major professional and academic as well as political force. In addition to that, we wanted to establish Negro History Week in the month of February because two of our most important contributors and heroes in the history of the Negro struggle in the United States were born in February. February 12th, Abraham Lincoln, and although we don't know for sure when he was born, Frederick Douglass indicated that his birthday was February 14th. So this is the reason we chose the month of February. I should also point out that we had a great many contributors to the association who were doing well economically in this great Gatsby period of the 1920s. This would change drastically after the great stock market crash of 1929. And with the establishment of the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt did something no other president had done up to that time. He actually established a group of Negro advisors that he will refer to as the Black Cabinet. People like Ralph Bunche and William Hastie, who would go on to be the first Black governor of the Virgin Islands and the first Black federal district court judge. Robert Weaver, who would head up something called the Federal Housing Administration and would eventually become the first Black cabinet secretary. Mary McLeod Bethune, who was a legendary educator and educational leader who was the founder of Bethune-Cookman College in Florida. One of the things they advised President Roosevelt to do was that as he was trying to preserve the humanities and the arts, because so many of the patrons of the arts lost money, did not have the money available to sponsor or commission artworks or poems or plays, he was instrumental. This group was instrumental in helping to create the Federal White Writers Project and the Federal Arts Project, where the federal government actually provided money to artists and writers to continue producing and being creative. These were very important to us as we pursued Negro History Week, because they contributed a great deal of material, many archives and documents and records during the 1930s. The other great force, of course, was World War II, because again, based on the experience that Negroes had in World War I, we use history to make the case through our spokesperson, A. Philip Randolph, that President Roosevelt needed to do something to end the discrimination against Negroes in the emerging defense-related industries as we got more and more involved in World War II. And as a result, we were able to do the background research for a very important executive order that was issued in 1941. This was Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in defense-related industries, and for the first time in our history, establishing a federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in the White House. And we were asked to actually do some of the background research that led to this executive order. Very important because as defense industries and locations expanded, not only in the north central part of the United States, not only in the South and the Midwest, but because we had an enemy in the Pacific, Western communities were growing, and Negroes were moving to San Diego and Los Angeles and the San Francisco Bay Area and Seattle and Portland. So this executive order contributed to what we like to refer to as the nationalization of the Negro population. As we moved also into the 1940s, the liberation movements in Africa and in the Caribbean intensified, and people all over the world began to see that as a consequence of World War II and the occupation of France, the damage to England, this loosened the teeth of a lot of the colonial mastery we had experienced for more than 100 years in Europe. And so we became aware of and became vigilant about those activities that were in Africa as they impacted on the Negro struggle in the United States. And people like Du Bois kept us abreast of the parallels between our movements and those movements. The other thing I should point out is that we were able, as a result of Negro History Week, to remind people every year of any new developments that took place in the experience and the status and the culture of Negroes. And we particularly followed the court decisions that were being pursued by the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, particularly the decision to overturn the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in a case of a young Black man who was trying to enter the University of Maryland Law School. And the principal said that if there was a Negro institution available that provided comparable education, then the Negroes should go there. And we were able to support Thurgood Marshall in demonstrating from the historical record that the only Negro institutions that existed at that time in higher education did not provide a comprehensive law school curriculum. So the appeals court, which is the Supreme Court of Maryland, overturned the Plessy principle and admitted Donald Gaines Murray to the University of Maryland. We also supported Thurgood Marshall's research as he was pursuing the end of the white primary in Texas in 1944. And in the case of Clarendon County in South Carolina, we actually helped Kenneth Clark to put together his study of the impact of segregation on the mind and the self-image concept of Negro children in his famous Dolls study. So there were many practical applications of our historical research. I also want to point out very quickly that as we established in the 1920s, the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, we also recognized that there were many publishers, mainstream publishers, who would not publish any material, historical or otherwise, on Negro culture or history. So I helped to establish a publishing company called Associated Publishers Press. And this was the first publication came out in 1921. We also established the Negro History Bulletin in 1927, and it continued to provide news connected to our history and culture to people on a more frequent basis. And I continued to be an active historian myself, publishing a total of 19 books over my career. The most important of which was The Negro in Our History, The Miseducation of the Negro, and several works on the history of Negroes in Washington, D.C., because Washington, D.C. was considered this refuge by many Negroes from the ravages of the Deep South, and they wanted to be under the direct protection of the federal government. So all of these publications continued into the 1940s. And as I was getting along with my academic career, Howard University asked me to come to first chair the history department under a dynamic and charismatic president, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson, who had come to Howard University as president in 1926. And then he subsequently asked me to be the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, which gave me a platform for not only researching Negro history, but also promoting it in our classrooms and in our curriculum. And we had one of the most comprehensive curricula at Howard that focused on Negro life and culture. We used the library, the Spingarn Library, we called it now the Moreland Spingarn Library, to build up archives on Negro history and culture that even the National Archives seemed reluctant to take on. We were able to persuade the Library of Congress to work with us in establishing and cataloging these records so that future historians could come along. So I'm happy to say that historians like John Hope Franklin, like C. Van Woodward, Rayford Logan, there were many others who worked with us in trying to establish not only Black History Week, but the wider promotion of Negro life and culture and the study of such Negro life and culture. Now, again, being right there in Washington, D.C. and living in a row house on 9th Street, I decided initially when we established our Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, our Negro History Bulletin, our Journal of Negro History, all of these would be headquartered in my home, right there on 9th Street, on the 3rd floor. So I would establish my residency on the 2nd floor, and I would entertain people on the 1st floor, but the library and the operations of the organization were on the 3rd floor, and the archives were on the 3rd floor. And it would not be until late in the 1950s that the association would establish its own building and headquarters. And I want to say that from this point, looking backwards, although I died in 1950, I want to point out that the association became very, very instrumental in supporting the civil rights movement throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. There was a young man who arose from Omaha to Boston to New York named Malcolm Little, who would become Malcolm X. And his life would be chronicled by a man who said he was very influenced by the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, and that was Alex Haley. And Haley would go on to write a monumental book called Roots, again, giving homage to the influence a lot of our organizations had on his thinking about his own ancestry in Africa. And I'm told by a number of people that at the association's meeting in 1973, Alex Haley was about to give a presentation on his new book, which originally was to be called Before This Anger. And before he could do that, the first Negro member of the Federal Reserve Board, Dr. Andrew Brimmer, who was the chair of our organization, came in and interrupted him and apologetically and said that there had been a major development in Washington, D.C. This is October 23rd of 1973. And that major development was that President Nixon had fired the special prosecutor in the Watergate investigation, Archibald Cox. And in protest, the Attorney General, Elliot Richardson, and his deputy, Williams Ruckelshaus, had resigned. It was called the October Massacre. Also in 1976, it was Nixon's vice president who, after Nixon's resignation on August 9th of 1974, it would be Gerald Ford who, with a presidential executive order, would establish Black History Month, taking our program from a week to a month. And he not only established the month as the frame of reference for celebrating Black history, but also connected Black history to a theme, an annual theme, which, as I understand it this year, is health, mental and physical health. So this greatly contributed to the development and understanding and utilization of Negro history and culture, as we were thinking not only about Negroes, but about their achievements and their role in American society and the major contribution to the building of America, not only the economic building of America, but also the moral building of America. Because as Thurgood Marshall was often fond of saying in the 1930s when he was traveling around those Southern courthouses trying to expand rights for Negroes, that he grew weary from time to time of trying to save the soul of the white man. So this was as much about white people coming to a better understanding of who they were and where they were in this historical journey and odyssey, as Negroes coming to understand who they were and who they are. So, my friends, as we think about Negro history and culture, we are saying three things. Number one, we are saying that this saga that we're talking about includes the beginning and the evolution of our country, but antedates it, goes back into the history of Europe, the history of Asia. This is really not just about the United States, although the evidence of it is certainly manifest in the United States. The growing up and the maturation of America, to a very great extent, has been associated with the growing up and maturation of the way we treat the people that make up the United States and their history and their culture. And secondly, that this is a worldwide phenomenon and not just a national phenomenon, so that every Negro can be proud of the fact that his and her ancestry is connected to many important developments in the world that have been marked as contributing to the progress of humankind. And the third thing we want to emphasize going forward here is that the next chapters, the next episodes of our experience here in the United States and our experience around the world, based on our historical legacy, our historical journey, the next chapters have to be written by you. You have to contribute these next chapters. And I urge you, before I conclude, to write these chapters carefully, write these chapters in collaboration with other people who have suffered oppression, indigenous people, people around the world who have been the victims of all kinds of racial marginalization. So write them carefully, write them eloquently, write them elegantly, because I'll be watching. I'll be watching. Thank you very much.
There we go. Thank you, Lanil. That was just fantastic. Thank you so very much. What an amazing performance, inspiring and provocative. I see you're getting a round of applause, a deafening round of applause and lots of hearts.
Thank you.
This is wonderful. So what we want to do right now is have our panelists come online. I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we'll go into a round of questions, and time permitting, we will also invite questions from the audience. I would like to ask the audience to make sure that you put your questions into the chat. There is a lot to work with here from what was just performed and shared. So let me just start with this round of introductions. I'd like to introduce to you one of our panelists, Dr. Anthony Green, faculty trustee, as well as doctoral faculty in clinical psychology. And he also serves as associate professor of counseling and wellness at University of Florida. Very nice to have Dr. Green here, especially with the theme for Black History Month, focusing on mental health and wellness. The next panelist that we have joining us this evening is Dr. Barbara Mink. She currently serves as the Dean of the School of Leadership Studies. Since 1978, Dr. Mink has been a professor at Fielding Graduate University. She teaches and supervises doctoral students in the areas of organizational change, management, and leadership, as well as learning and motivation. Dr. Nicola Smith is a member of the doctoral faculty in the School of Leadership at Fielding and holds a JD from Harvard Law School. So she's following in the traditions of W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Orlando Taylor, who is our distinguished senior advisor to the president, also serves as PI and executive director of CASEL and director of the Marie Fielder Center. He is with us this evening as part of the panel. And Dr. David Blake Willis, doctoral faculty in the School of Leadership Studies, holds 2 PhDs, one in the social sciences and the other in education, and has taught internationally. So these are our panelists, and we are just delighted to have them join us this evening. Really an opportunity for us to think and reflect on the power, the strength, the inspiration, and quite frankly, the strivings of Black history in this moment. So I'm going to open a question for our panelists to consider. And one of those is, in reviewing the life of Carter G. Woodson, what in particular stood out to you and had the strongest impact on you personally? And I think what I'll do, I will call on people as I look at my Hollywood squares here. So I'm going to start with Orlando Taylor.
I was afraid you were going to call me first. Well, thank you, Lanil, for your contributions tonight. Certainly, Carter G. Woodson is a very important figure in our American history, not just Black history, because he spent most of his lifetime and not only chronicling the history of Blacks in the United States, but also advocating for the recognition of that history. And he's given credit for, as has been indicated, for advocating for the presence of Negro History Week in later month, which occurred in the 20th century. That is a significance, I think. People often will say that if you lose a people's history, then you lose them. And the history that we often think about, that has often been thought about, rather, with respect to African Americans in the United States, has been one of deprivation, one of exploitation, one of slavery and segregation, but rarely, not as much, nearly as much, on the significant contributions made to the history of the world, but especially the history of the nation, in terms of discovery, in terms of government, in terms of military participation, and in terms of education in particular in higher education. At some point during this panel, I want to talk a little bit about the significance of the historically Black colleges and universities, which are an extremely important part of preserving this history. Lanil mentioned the Moreland Spingarn Library at Howard University, where I had the privilege of serving on the faculty for over 30 years. And it is a place where this great history is housed. And it is important that we have this history, otherwise the history will be lost. And therefore the contributions not only to the people of color, to African Americans, but to the country, to the nation, would be lost. So those are just my reflections about Carter G. Woodson.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I really like your calling out and raising up and amplifying the role of the HBCUs, the history and the role of the HBCUs in this important work. Dr. Nicola Smith, I noticed you are unmuted.
Yes, I am unmuted, but I want to thank Lanil first for such a stirring presentation. You know, every time I hear Lanil give one of these, whether it's Martin Luther King or Thurgood Marshall or Du Bois, I always say, that's it. That's absolutely the acme. He can't do better than that. And then you give another one, Lanil. So I look forward to just being challenged in terms of my enriched understanding and appreciation of some of these giants that have made the country what it is and made us what we are. You know, I'm excited to get to those questions. So I'm not going to go on, Allison. I'm going to end mine right here because the questions that you circulated, particularly, where do we go from here? Martin Luther King's question. I think that is very much the challenge before us, and I want to benefit from the thinking of all those who are on the call and on the panel.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Dr. Mink, I notice you also are unmuted.
Well, I want to echo what Nicholas said. I just always am enthralled when Lanil does one of these channeling of a person. And the depth and the history that he gives is just amazing. The thing that I was struck by with Woodson is how some of these people from history are such Renaissance men in this case, world traveler, active in the arts, in politics, in law, starting a business. He's a historian, he was a writer, he was an academic. And you sit there thinking, what am I doing with my life when this person can have such an impact and influence so many other people? But that's the sense that I got, the power and the resonance and the totality of this person and the presence in so many areas of influence. That's what I came away with from this piece.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Mink. Dr. Green.
Thank you. So yes, I also was so enriched by the presentation because of the depth of history that was portrayed through that autobiographical journey of one man. Usually you'll get a snippet of Black history, but there was so much richness and depth that I just want to say thank you as well. What struck me most about his life was the centrality of education. And I believe it is one of the most effective ways to promote social change. Definitely not the only one. There are peaceful and non-peaceful strategies as well, but I think his experience at Harvard was really representative, where he was pretty much blackmailed into studying European history because he wanted to study African history and was dissuaded from doing that. And so I think that represents his struggle for the rest of his life to try to promote and disseminate Black history, Negro history as he called it. And so that's what stood out for me.
Thank you, Dr. Green. I'd like to really just sort of raise up one of the comments you made about the importance of having that sort of epistemic diversity in education. And we're seeing that same conversation sort of come back today in probably a little bit of a different form, but it's still the same sort of conversation about valuing, right? Diverse histories, diverse ways of knowing, diverse epistemologies. You know, I was thinking, as central as this is to education, and I think I want to go back to what Dr. Taylor mentioned about the importance of that. It's also a part of a pedagogical practice. And so I'm really kind of curious how and in what ways we're going to do that sort of work moving forward, especially since some of these conversations seem to be recycled and maybe packaged a little differently, but also recycled. Dr. David Blake Willis.
Thank you so much, Dr. Woodson, for your presentation today. Certainly appreciate hearing from you. As always, we learn so much from you. You know, ever since we heard you first on the, in the lecture halls at Harvard, where you should have been hired, I think. Absolutely, you should have been hired there. And we don't understand why, well, we do understand why that didn't happen. But you've shown so much light on all of us. The lessons of Carter G. Woodson, wow, what a powerful drive and passion for visibility, consciousness raising at its best. And this is consciousness raising, of course, for the Black community, but for the national consciousness. And Carter G. Woodson, when I first learned about him, made me feel proud to be a fellow American. And of course, the philosopher Santayana said, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We do see people who don't remember the past right now. They're attempting to stop the teaching of history in the schools. We see that as Dr. Taylor has shared with us, Orlando shared with us, Carter G. Woodson was an historian of all Americans. We need to pay attention to all of this. I am encouraged by the recent opinion poll results, which say that most of the population does not agree with the criticism of critical race theory, and the teaching of Black history essentially is what they're attacking here. Carter G. Woodson was also, of course, not just an educator, as A.G. has shared with us, but he was a global educator. There were lessons of history for all of us in what he has shared, and he would certainly be commenting on the imperialism, the colonialism of Russia's invasion of Ukraine that has just happened. At the same time, he supported the flourishing of the arts, the flourishing of the Harlem Renaissance, which in many ways was American art at its highest. Very central to modern American culture, this valuing. And again, the attempt to silence this history of the US, it will not stand. It's not going to stand. You know, the pride that people have in their heritage is something that needs to be embraced by everyone. And we're so lucky to have this exemplar for all of us as a scholar and a human being. My goodness, we've all benefited from Carter G. Woodson.
Professor Willis, if I could just make a brief comment of what you just said.
Sure.
Is that it's important to remember that Carter G. Woodson, though he was a dues-paying member of the American Historical Society, could not attend the conventions.
Right.
He could not attend the conventions. He was could not appear on the programs. And of course, no African American at the time was a member of the faculty of a predominantly white institution at the time. The only place, he actually ended up initially at high school in Washington, D.C., and he later much of his career was at Howard. And so the point is that institutions that are now trying to suppress knowledge around the country also suppress it in higher education. We like to talk
Yes.
about how great our institutions are, but Harvard had no Black faculty. And he was only the second African American to get a degree there. So the issue of we're not clean in higher education either is a point.
No, not at all.
And particularly in terms of faculty, in terms of a place to do the scholarly work, to have access to libraries and so forth. that is within the century that we just ended. So we need to keep that history in context and in mind about the intellectual struggles this man had to engage in order to get the history recorded and archived for us today.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. That was a very powerful statement and certainly is central to this conversation about Carter G. Woodson. There's an amazing scholar by the name of Jarvis Givens who has written a book called Fugitive Pedagogy, Carter G. Woodson and the Art of Black Teaching. And in his book, he states that our language, when it comes to Black education, is impoverished. Knowing how education has been a site of deep hurt and suffering on the one hand, and yet a sacred site of Black spiritual strivings on the other. I think that sort of captures what you're saying, Dr. Taylor, and I'd like to just open this up to our faculty to respond to, how are we able to hold both of these perhaps contrasting issues in academic spaces? The fact that we know our history has been a site of deep hurt and suffering, and yet it has also been a sacred site of spiritual strivings. Does anyone have thoughts on how we might be able to do that? What will it take in the classroom?
I think one really important thing in terms of the visibility that Carter G. Woodson brought to all of this is also what Indigenous folks, Ali, bring to us, the sacred sites. And you mentioned a sacred site of spiritual strivings. We have a lot of those sacred sites right in front of us, right in our local communities. And to understand those sites and what they have meant to the history of where we are living. And, those spirits are still with us.
I just share a quick quote from Woodson himself, who, by the way, has a monograph you found in the archives talking about the intersection of Negro history with not only other Africans, but also with indigenous populations. He was talking about the Seminoles and the Choctaws and their alliances. But he said that one of the things that was important to him as a scholar activist was radical listening. And by radical listening, he meant that you had to listen more than with the ear. Your heart had to be inclined toward the environment that you were dealing with and the experiences that produced that environment. And that this radical listening was very difficult. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to discipline yourself to do. But as a historian and a cultural analyst, he thought it was absolutely imperative to teach his students how to do that. And the other thing, ironically, he said, was that I had to listen in a radical way to my students too, because as we are generating our courses and regenerating them every time we teach them, part of what we're doing is incorporating the feedback not only from our peers, but the feedback both in words and in behavior from our scholars.
I think what came to mind for me with relation to that question is what psychology is going through, a kind of a reckoning, acknowledging the harm that has been done by your field of practice or study, and acknowledging the lack of total control that you have over what it has become, so that sitting with a client, you qualify and apologize in advance that what I'm doing may be harmful to you, and I'm going to do my best to try not to have any harm come to you. But historically, harm has happened, and you should know that. And so I think similar kind of framing in the curriculum, that I am shepherding you into an institution that has done harm and has the potential to do you harm. And you should know that as you're moving forward. So reckoning, acknowledging, and moving forward with humility.
That's very, very nice, Dr. Green. Reckoning and acknowledging and moving forward are really powerful themes. And maybe that's a great way to thread this into our second question, which is really kind of tying Black history to where we are now and where we need to be heading, moving forward, if you will, in the future. So as we reflect on Black history through time, and in particular, the various moments of conflict for civil and human rights, we cannot help but think of Dr. King's poignant and haunting question regarding the state of the nation on diversity. The complete title of his publication was, "Where do we go from here? Chaos or community?" In a sense, the publication was King's analysis of the state of American race relations and the movement after a decade of US civil rights struggles. And he warned that the persistence of racism in depth and the dawning awareness that Negro demands will necessitate structural changes in society have generated a new phase of white resistance in North and South. Is this where we are today, or are we in a different phase? As scholar practitioners who work in the area of social justice, what direction do you see as current national or even global trends? Where are we heading? And I think I'll start with Orlando. Dr. Taylor, do you have some thoughts?
Well, I'm afraid that my thoughts are negative and pessimistic. I think that the current attack on academic freedom in the country, I think that the efforts to abolish teaching of certain subject matters really violate some of the sacred premises about what an education is supposed to be, to expose people to diverse ideas and to diverse perspectives and diverse research findings, is under attack. I feel I think of it as a book I remember back in the 80s, I think it was, Silencing of the Lambs. Basically how good people are quiet and those with the loud voices on the right primarily are the ones that are dominating the narrative. And so until I hear vigorous and uncompromising voices on the importance of hearing diverse perspectives and opinions in higher education, I feel quite disturbed. The individual running for governor of Texas now, for example, has made some statements about getting rid of tenure in the public institutions in the state of Texas, which is a chilling statement about something we in the academic world hold sacred, academic freedom. We want our students to be able to be exposed to history and different perspectives of knowledge, and that's a part of what an education is. But our faculty must be uncompromising in defending the significance of academic freedom and ideas in the marketplace, such that we can preserve the great traditions of higher education in our country. That is what I think is really an important lesson, even for this month, because remember, Carter G. Woodson was going against the norm of history, and he was writing in the 19 teens and 20s, which had a different narrative.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor.
I've got a couple of thoughts, Allison. Actually, one of the strongest voices, Orlando, that I heard about what you're talking about and the silencing of diverse opinions and stuff came from a very odd source to me today. I was listening to John Oliver, the talk show. I mean, he had a powerful statement about what's happening with people. I think he said 37 of the 50 states are trying to abolish critical race theory. And he was just profoundly strong about the need for this. It sounded like I'm an educator, but I really was taken away by the power of his argument this morning on kind of a YouTube channel. The other thing, talk about powerful words, I went back to Dr. King's actually talk on where do we go from here. And when I was reading that and listening to, 37 of the 50 states have abolished critical race theory or are about to, I made this phrase, instead of where do we go from here, I was saying to myself, where do we go from here? It's just like, what is our next step? And then when I read the speech by Dr. King, the phrases he had, and I'm going to read some of them here. We need the restructuring of the whole of American society. America, you must be born again, was his phrase. We must go on with divine dissatisfaction. And that kind of term, we can't be, it's let us be dissatisfied until. And then he had a lot of phrases that came after that. Until integration is not seen as a problem, but as an opportunity to participate in the beauty of diversity. Let us be dissatisfied until, and this was your thing, Orlando, about governors, every state capital will be housed by a governor who will do justice, who will love mercy, and will walk humbly with his God. Let us be dissatisfied until from every city hall, justice will roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I mean, that just spoke to my heart, the power of his phrase. And then going on, the road's going to be rocky. It's going to be frustrating. There's going to be bewilderment, he said. But he said, let's go on with audacious faith in the future. And that's the hope that I have, the audacious faith in the future.
And I see you're getting a lot of thumbs up on the audacious faith in the future. and thank you for sharing those passages. I think they're very important. I'd like to turn now to Dr. Nicola Smith, because this was something you were waiting for. You were waiting for this specific question.
I was, and yet now I have to give more preface, because what Orlando said about negativity, and I feel all of that. What Barbara said about where do we go from here, and Barbara, thank you for providing such an open vision of where we might go, where we may yet go. And also back to Lanil, where he was giving Carter Woodson's injunction to us all that we're to be writing these next chapters, and that he would be watching and to write them with eloquence and elegance. I think that is so important. And I guess what I would say about where do we go from here and where do we go from here is that we need to summit. Our time horizons are often so short that they do a disservice to our principles and our vision. And if we look at who America will be in 2050 or 2070, and summit and plan for that America and deploy our positions, state our principles in terms of that multiplicity of American origins and ethnicities that will make up our body at that time, we may find more success in the short run. But if there's anything I'll say, and I'll link on that darn Harvard that you mentioned, Allison, because I've had more people correct me. Oh no, you meant Howard. And I said, yes, that's it, to just take it off the table. But I recall when I was sought to be recruited to be a right-wing Black, superstar. Back in my days at the law school, where they were trying to attract me. And the man said, it's quite all right that you're not interested. We have other excellent candidates among your class here at Harvard and at our premier schools. And I think we know the names of some of those people now. But what impressed me about that man's approach, and he came with his checkbook. It's a good story. I won't tell it, but I will say this. He was planning he was planning 50 years out, a half century out. And he said to me, we've lost it now in the 70s, but we're going to get it again. We're going to get the nation back into a hyper-conservative orientation, and we're never going to let it go. I want to see us plan in that fashion, summit in that fashion. What kind of America do we need to be for ourselves and for the world in 2070? And how do we get there?
It's an excellent thought there, Dr. Smith. What kind of America do we want to be in 2070? And this thinking, this sort of forward thinking really aligns well with indigenous thought around planning for 7 generations to come. So I'd really like to hear more about that. And I'd also like to hear from Dr. Green, your thoughts on where we are headed as a nation. Where do we go from here?
So I have the same pessimism, but I do have some optimism that follows that pessimism. I feel that we have historically seen cycles, just like Jim Crow was a reaction to the abolishment of slavery, and then we make a little progress and we find a way around that, and then there's redlining, and then we find a way around that. And so I think that we kind of have a push and a pushback, and that the current argument against teaching critical race theory is a pushback against the push. And I think where we're headed is, like Dr. King was talking about, being increasingly dissatisfied and more segregated in our thinking. I think there are going to be civil wars and unrest and many massacres on many levels in the courts and out of the courts until we're near this chaos. But through the DEI efforts, IDEA efforts, where we will have the mixing of this diverse pool of ideas, that's where we can move forward after the chaos into this vision that Nicola speaks of and that Barbara speaks of. But I think we're going to go through some difficult times before we get there.
It sounds like you're really resonating with a lot of people on the call. I see hand claps and thumbs up. I'd really like to hear from you, Dr. Henderson, and then Dr. Willis, what your thoughts are on that, especially given that everybody seems to have various levels of mixes of both pessimism and optimism. And there is talk in our country right now of not only ideological divides, but also the possibility of violence in this time in our nation.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we have always been a violent nation, so that won't be new. It's to be a form of violence and against whom and with the consequences it'll be new. But a couple of unorthodox reflections. One is that coming back to history, whenever we've been shut out, I come back to Dr. Taylor's comment about Dr. Woodson being banned from participating in the American Historical Society, rather than close up his shop and go away despondent, he did something about it. He did something about it. And that doing something about it has resulted in a progeny that is still with us today. I mean, one of the things I should mention is that when he was told that he shouldn't study African history, and he studied very well European history, he used that to reach Africa, the same way Du Bois used his experience in Germany to understand colonialism from the inside a little bit better. And in addition to that, I think he would be proud to know that especially in the 1950s and 60s, especially in the 1960s, we saw this proliferation of new academic and occupational organizations that in their respective fields did exactly what he did in establishing the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. So we have the Black psychologists, we have the Black social workers, we have the Black political scientists who started 50 years ago. We have a National Economics Association, which is basically Black and third world economists who said to their professions, you're not doing anything or doing enough to include the experiences, the needs, and the relationships of our folks. So rather than go away and pout, we're going to form our own organizations. We're going to generate our own publications, and we're going to create our networks with the community as you should be doing. So I think as pessimistic as all this looks, as devastating as it looks, the great irony is that in its own strange, paradoxical way, it's actually helping to raise consciousness about the issues, right? Because I think we were beginning to lapse a little bit into a kind of lethargic state until these attacks on critical race theory occurred, which reminds us, by the way, of the same attacks they made on ethnic studies in the 60s, Black studies in the 70s, et cetera. That reminds you that you may be doing something momentous. You may be doing something significant, because people are not going to waste their time coming at you unless you're doing something that means something. So, so that's one thought. The other thought, and I'll conclude on this, is that in every situation that looked like it was, fairly divided into people for and people against, there's always something called the wild card, something nobody saw coming that can ultimately make the difference in how this thing turns out. And it could be a war, it could be climate change, it could be any number of combinations of things. So it's not just us playing on this field against each other in this game now. It's also what's going on out there in the stadium and what's going out there in the streets beyond the stadium that might produce the recipe for many of the things that Barbara referred to here that will represent next steps. I mean, if somebody had told me when I was in graduate school, hey, by the time you are a flourishing academic, there won't be any Soviet Union anymore. We're going to have something in a little box that'll do most of the communicating for us. I would have thought they hadn't taken their medicines that day, but here we are. So what's going to be on the immediate horizon? I really like Nicola's framing about the 2070 and 2050 and 2070, because there are some changes taking place in the world and around the world and in the universe here that we have to take into account when we ask these questions about where we go from here, and combine them with whatever we think we need to do and how we need to do it. So I always believe, and this is a non-practicing or non-professional psychologist speaking, that optimism is a necessary precondition for effective acting. You can fuel yourself on pessimism only so far, but the number of miles remaining on your tank will be much more limited than if you are more optimistic and say, look, I have faith that somehow we are going to find the way forward that is inclusive, incorporates more people, and really does make a contribution to the restructuring and the reformulation of our country.
Thank you, Dr. Henderson. That's very powerful. And I want to take some of those threads that you've shared, and you did a great job bringing in everybody's thoughts into this, and turn this over to David Willis and get some comments there. Are there threads in there, David, that
yes,
align?
absolutely. Thank you so much for this. And Lanil, I want to echo you and others on the importance of vigorous and uncompromising voices. The importance of vigorous and uncompromising voices. Martin Luther King, of course, said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. So I guess ultimately I'm with that phrase, and I have a guarded optimism. Orlando, I share with you the pessimism day to day at times when I see the news, but I think Carter G. Woodson had an audacious faith and hope in the future. And yes, indeed, this diverse pool of ideas leading us to 2050 to 2070. I'm very encouraged by the recent advances following Black Lives Matter. But again, I'm guarded in my optimism. We have to be vigilant. Eventually, community will be triumphing over chaos, but the deep racism of American society still needs deep work as well. I was again encouraged, and I'll put it in the chat now, by the report of a poll yesterday that shows that most Americans disagree with the conservative campaign to ban books and limit discussions on race, that they believe that there is a need to have these discussions. So, and we need to pay attention to what folks are wanting, you know, not just what the bully agenda is driving things. As Carter G. Woodson also said, let us banish fear. There's this mental state that's easy for all of us to get into, and certainly Black folks for many centuries being slaves and all. Carter G. Woodson also said, I'm a radical. I'm ready to act if I can find brave folks to help me. And he began changing, transforming the whole American, the whole person, the whole society, the whole nation, and the whole humanity going forward here. You know, certainly he was barred from the American Historical Association, but he took action, as Orlando and others have mentioned here, creating his own separate institutional structures for this and all. I would finally say, who is neglected now? Who are the people that Mahatma Gandhi referred to as the last man or the last woman, Frantz Fanon's Wretched of the Earth? Who are the folks now who are the most marginalized? We should be thinking about them in the picture as well.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Willis. Absolutely. And I think that's the purpose of having these kinds of conversations, is really to reflect on that. You know, so where do we go from here already has embedded in it who is in the conversation, who is outside of the conversation, who has voice and who doesn't have voice. And what are we going to do about it? And I think that's really what we're trying to get at, is what are we going to do about it? I'm going to kind of turn this question a little bit and just ask, what can we do? What is our responsibility? And what can we do to ensure global equity, racial and social justice? All of us are scholar practitioners. All of us have some level of commitment. I'm curious, what is it that people can do? And we have about 15, or maybe a little less than that, minutes remaining. So I'd like the comments to be brief. But as we think about moving forward, yes, Dr. Mink.
I will be brief, and I'm going to put in a pitch for one of my, I think one of the strongest institutions that really is fighting in this field. And I'm going to take a pitch for supporting your local community college. I'm very serious about this in terms of when they really started, a lot of community colleges came in the 70s, the 60s. They turned a lot of economic factors around. They opened up opportunities for all people. And I was sitting in the Austin Community College graduation this past December, and there were a couple of thousand students down on the floor of the auditorium. And our president said, you know, we want to welcome everybody. Of our graduates, who in your graduate is one of the first people or the first person in your family to graduate from college? Almost the entire auditorium stood up. The power of that is just amazing for looking at transforming people's lives and transforming families and making a difference in society. So we have a Center for the Study of Racial Healing at Austin Community College, and a lot of community colleges are looking at that, the equity issue in student services and student success. So I'm going to kind of hang my hat on the power of the community colleges to make a significant difference in the landscape of America.
Thank you, Barbara. I think you're absolutely right as we think about education. And I think that ties into some of the things that Dr. Martin Luther King also shared about economic justice and the ways that we influence that and are engaged in that work. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think also we can't dismiss little miracles. You know, we're looking for the big picture. the little things that go on every day from people to people that don't follow this oppressive and exclusive pattern, we ought to lift up and affirm wherever we can. I was really heartened to hear just yesterday about 5 high schools in Chicago who were the beneficiaries of a commitment made by an entrepreneur who wanted to keep it anonymous, where he would pay for their entire college education and simultaneously the education of one of their parents at the same time. That's a commitment of multiple millions of dollars. I think about Scott McKenzie. Yes, we can say it's just a fraction of her fortune, but the fact that she gave that much money to those many HBCUs and grassroots organizations is not insignificant. And so we may not have the resources to do things on that scale, but we do have the spiritual and affective resources to do that on our scale. And whatever we can do, it will make a contribution to the ocean. And I think that, don't think just because you're a little dot there that that doesn't make some difference, So the other thing about King, I remember when he came to Berkeley to recruit us to go to the Poor People's Campaign, was he said, look, remember the 1963 march was for freedom and jobs, freedom and jobs. And when you are going for the economic dimension of your liberation, you're not necessarily trying to overwhelm everyone with the new wealth that you found. You're really trying to just make the living that you need to make for you and your family, while at the same time preserving your moral core. And he reminded us, that Jesus, one of Jesus's great acts in the New Testament was to chase the money changers out of the temple, right? I think he missed a few, but but that was one of his big contributions. So this balance here of the small miracle and the big move, the little strategy and the big strategy need to be combined. I think what Barbara said is super compelling, because those community colleges are closer to the community in higher education than anything else we have. And so I really hope we'll follow up on that. And then the fact that we have people that we have here in our community who are doing things that many of us are partially aware of, but not fully aware of, that can make a contribution. If we inventory that, we can see that we're much more impactful than we think we are. So all of those things combined, it's not just should we do this at the exclusion of that, or this or that, but all of that spiritually driven and carefully considered.
And let's not forget a very important something we can do is spell VOTE, vote, and get involved with organizations that get out the vote, make contributions to campaigns for people who will truly believe in justice. Voting cannot be understated. And I listened to the statistic that you mentioned, Lanil, about the majority, somebody put it in the chat, majority of people who support teaching about the realities and the history of race in America, I think the percentage I saw in one of the chats is 59%. Suppose they all voted.
Right, that's right.
Then we'd be in a different place. That's again, the silence of the lambs. We have to vote. We have to be participant in the democracy. Otherwise, those who don't believe this are very aggressive about getting people to vote and stopping people to vote.
That's right.
So that cannot be understated. If we really are committed to a just society being perpetuated, is to both vote and to support and encourage others to vote.
So that's even moving beyond just having a just society as well. It's about protecting our democracy. And right now, that is a question. There is a crisis of relevance around democracy, and people are questioning that.
And Orlando, Karen just put in the chat, in addition to voting, running for office, getting out there and having your voice heard too.
Yes.
Is a powerful addition.
Well, one of the things I'm encouraged by is that according to the Eagleton Institute at Rutgers, of 519,000 elective offices in the United States, we have 78,000 female elected officials. That number has doubled in the last 2 or 3 years. And I think it's been a good thing. And we've seen female mayors now come into office in Chicago, Boston, San Francisco, New Orleans, Washington, D.C. And with the exception of Baltimore, they've all done a good job. I mean, they've all done an exceptional job.
That's fantastic. Dr. Green and then Dr. Willis.
So yeah, I think similarly to Dr. Henderson, that we have to be influential in our sphere of influence. No matter how small, no matter how large, talk to the people that you can talk to, advocate, be an activist, support with your dollars, whatever you can do. I have some issue with the idea of little miracles. I think any miracle is huge. It's a miracle. So, yeah, I think no matter what that thing is that you can do that and use your influence. Voting, yeah, definitely that's one of the things we can all do.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Green. Now, one moment, Nicola, I might have not seen Nicola on my screen here. Comment before I go to David Blake Willis.
Okay, and I'll be brief with it. I love the voting. I love the little miracles. I love the acting. I think of our DLCs, which I believe are brilliantly conceived. When you take this degree, if it's not just to be a selfish act, you really need to find a way to make its benefits general, make its benefits such that it really does uplift and enrich those that you interact with on a daily, ordinary, just typical basis. And in that regard, I would say the critical thinking, Mike Goldstein put something in the chat with regard to that. These issues become so conflated, they become so collapsed in on each other, they become so unnecessarily complicated that democracy begins to seem like it's too taxing, like we don't have the energy to maintain the system, that even though we love it, we're beginning to love it as a relic rather than as a living, breathing way to connect with each other. And so I want to say to those of us who are on the call, who have the benefit of the real privileges and the real luxuries that an education confers on us, that we need to model a behavior, and a behavior that's a level playing field behavior, even in our own interactions, because I think one of the things that's been the undoing of us as a scholarly establishment is our superiority, our arrogance, such that we can no longer communicate with those relatives who didn't come through the same halls of academia that we did. And I think for the change agents, which is what I see fielding people as being, learning how to take those walls down and to model the behaviors we want to see in other people and that we want to connect with in other people, so that we can really help ourselves and others to think across boundaries, to inquire, to reflect, rather than simply to judge and react, etc. I think that's one of those small miracles, and one of the things that I heard Dr. Green refer to.
Thank you, Nicola. Excellent comments. And Dr. Willis, I'm sure there's pieces there also that you'll pick up on.
Carter, absolutely. Carter G. Woodson was a change agent par excellence. And after he graduated from college, I'm not sure folks know this, but he was a school supervisor in the Philippines. And later he traveled throughout Europe and Asia. So he was one of the early voices on globalization and speaking for and understanding the power of globalization to change all of us. And now we are faced with the questions of decolonization, with truth and reconciliation, we as a nation are not going to be able to move ahead until we get to the truth and reconciliation, until we get to the reparations. We need to have this fellowship of reconciliation. And we need to recognize too, especially white folks, we need to recognize how we are complicit and what we need to do. Canvassing, getting the vote out, absolutely important to be out there knocking on doors. And finally, Carter G. Woodson's example has inspired us, especially through the power of consciousness raising.
Well, thank you so much for all of your thoughts, panelists. Each and every one of you are amazing, and that's why you're fielding faculty, and we're blessed to have you here. I think at the end of this conversation, I think we can all come away with a better understanding of Carter G. Woodson, how his values and ideals can be lived out in our own work, but also how it ties to the greater challenge that faces us all. And I think, kind of echoing some of the words that were shared by Nicholas Smith and Barbara Mink, approaching it with hope and resilience is where we need to go. And I think that as we move forward, we'll be moving forward together as a country. And this is going to be a journey that we're all going to take together. And again, it's a question of what kind of America do we want to build together. So I want to thank you for participating in our DEI critical conversation. We're hoping to have more of these. We need your support. And we're going to be developing these as we move forward, but really want to thank all of you for participating this evening. And a special thank you to our panelists and to Dr. Lanil Henderson for the wonderful rendition of Carter G. Woodson. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Allison. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Hey, take care of yourselves.
Thank
Bye,
you
everybody.
for the forum.
Okay, bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.